Okay, in this video, I would like to talk just a little bit about some of the different types of vertebrae that you're going to find, as well as some of the kind of key features of vertebrae. Okay, so I'm just going to pick one here, and this just happens to be a thoracic vertebrae, but you know, it really doesn't matter. I could pick a lumbar. As far as just kind of general features go, you have kind of, for your practicals, some specific things that I want you to know. You should be able to identify the body. That's the real big, thick part. I mean, you can see the body of a lumbar. There's the body of a thoracic. Okay, that's going to be what supports the weight. And in between the bodies of the vertebrae, there will be a disc called a intervertebral disc. Just posterior to that, where my finger is currently resting, is the vertebral foramen, and that's where you'll find the spinal cord. Okay? So this is anterior, back here would be posterior, extending directly behind and posterior to that vertebral foramen is the spinous process. Okay? You can see that really well with our lumbar one right here. The spinous process is that right there, and those are the bumps that you can actually feel that run down your spine. You know, if you run your fingers down the back of somebody, and then you've got two more bumps, and you can really see it with our thoracic vertebrae here. Okay, those are called spinous or transverse processes. Excuse me. So transverse processes are going to project kind of more laterally. So those are kind of the major structures as far as just kind of a general vertebra go. One other thing, or some other things that you'll need to be able to identify, should be able to basically identify the difference between the three major regions of the vertebral column. Over here on the right, we've got a pretty typical cervical vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae, generally pretty small. The body is really, really small. A key feature of the cervical vertebrae is the presence of these two extra holes, which are called transverse foramina, okay, or transverse foramen for singular. So, like I said, they're going to be really small, really dainty. The model here doesn't show it very well, but a lot of times you'll see that there's a forking going on with the spinous process, and the transverse processes are pretty much non-existent for the most part. Now, the cervical vertebrae is going to have kind of two special vertebrae, the cervical region, I should say. You've got the atlas and the axis. Okay, the atlas is C1, very, very first cervical vertebrae. This is what our head actually rests on. And then on the right here, we have the axis. Okay, and the axis is going to have this structure called the Dens process that actually projects up into C1, and that's what actually allows us to turn our head. And so that's actually kind of how it looks when you put them together, and then the head would rest on top of those. Okay. The rest of the cervical vertebrae should look very similar to the one I just showed you just a little bit ago. Now, as we move towards the chest region, we'll find the thoracic vertebrae. And you'll notice I'm kind of holding it sideways, which is kind of the easiest way to identify thoracic vertebrae. And that's basically because their spinous process is going to kind of point downwards, and this one's really typical of that. I've had students tell me in the past that it looks like a giraffe. I necessarily don't see it, but you know, that's kind of something that they've mentioned in the past. And then the big, boxy, blocky lumbar vertebrae, really thick, really block-shaped, really, really strong, but they're not going to have a lot of motion associated with them. So, you know, they're going to support a great deal amount of weight, but they're going to have kind of limited mobility. Okay. So those are the kind of major regions of the vertebrae. If I can grab the sacrum, we can kind of finish off talking about the spinal column. Sacrum is going to be part of the pelvic cavity. It forms kind of the posterior wall of the pelvic cavity. It actually begins as 5 separate vertebrae that fuse somewhere, around the ages of, 20, 25. So, as you start progressing through college. And then the coccyx, which you can see down here at the bottom, which is going to consist of 4 small vertebrae that also fuse around that time. As far as the practical goes, really just know the coccyx. The sacrum does have some special features. This happens to be the anterior, which is easy to tell because it's always going to have the tail pointing forward instead of backwards, otherwise our tail would stick out. And you'll notice there's these 8 holes. Okay, those are called anterior sacral foramens or foramina, so each one is an anterior sacral foramen, and there are 8 total of them. And then if you look on the back side, those holes come all the way through, and that makes those, posterior sacral foramens or foramina. Okay. Now, a couple more things to identify, and this model is not the best for showing it, but that's okay. There should be a actual canal that runs right where my thumb is and then exits out right where my index finger is. We call that the sacral canal, and it runs through those kind of bony plates on the back of the sacrum and allows some nerves that extend down from the spinal cord to kind of exit out through that sacral hiatus, which is what my finger's pointing to, and then down into our legs. The very last structures of the or features of the sacrum to know are these kind of rough edges here, which we call auricular surfaces, and those are going to articulate with your hip bones together to form the entire hip and the pelvis as a whole, at what we call the sacroiliac joint. Sacro for sacrum, iliac for the iliac region of the hip bone. So that will conclude our video on the vertebrae.